In every crime, there's a reflection. A motive hidden in plain sight. A truth distorted by silence. Welcome to the Forensic Mirror, where psychology meets evidence, and every case reveals more than just what happened, it reveals why. Welcome back, truth seekers. You're now tuned into the Forensic Mirror, where shadows speak and silence is never innocent. Each week, we peel back the layers of guilt, decode the psychological fingerprints, and stare straight into the eyes of calculated chaos. This isn't just true crime. It's truth, dissected. Madness, mapped. And justice, relentlessly pursued. Please don't forget to follow, so you will know when I drop another crime episode. Also, head over to Conversations with Impact, which is another Spotify podcast of mine, where I talk about any and everything. Thanks to all. Episode 10, The Red Barn Murder of 1828. Welcome back to the Forensic Mirror. Today I will be diving into another chilling case in the Victorian-era history. In this episode, I will be exploring the notorious Red Barn Murder of 1828 in inPolstead, Suffolk. I will be delving into its cultural, social, and psychological impact on 19th century of British society. It examines the lives of Maria Marten, a marginalized young woman seeking security, and William aka Foxy Corder, whose history of deceit and manipulation culminated in tragedy. The narrative reveals how the isolated village setting, rigid social structures, and prevailing anxieties of the era contributed to the lasting legend and fascination surrounding the case. Stay tuned while we get started.
The pastoral tranquility of 19th-century Suffolk, characterized by its undulating landscapes and the rhythmic cycles of agricultural labor, was fundamentally shattered by a series of events that would eventually coalesce into one of the most enduring legends in the annals of British criminology. The Red Barn Murder of 1828 was not merely a localized act of violence. It was a cultural phenomenon that exposed the deep-seated anxieties of a society in transition, a case where the boundaries between the supernatural, the scientific, and the sensational became inextricably blurred. At the heart of this tragedy lay two figures, Maria Marten and William Corder, whose fatal entanglement served as a catalyst for a national obsession with the macabre that has persisted for nearly 2 centuries. To understand the mystery, one must first consider the isolation of Polstead, a village where social stratification was as rigid as the clay-heavy soil of the East Anglian fields. The Red Barn itself, situated atop Barnfield Hill, was a structure that commanded a view of the surrounding countryside, yet it remained a place of profound solitude, located a full quarter of a mile from the nearest human habitation. This landmark, named for its distinctive red-tiled roof, was part of the Corder family's farm property, a site that would transform from a mundane agricultural storehouse into a locus of visceral horror. The landscape surrounding the barn was often described in local lore as being fraught with ill omens. The play of light upon the hill and the dense thickets nearby made it an ideal location for clandestine meetings, a place where the social constraints of the village could be momentarily suspended. For Maria Marten, the barn represented a promise of escape. For William Corder, it was a site of tactical utility where a long-standing problem could be buried away from the prying eyes of a judgmental community. The biographical details of Maria Marten, born on July 24, 1801, reveal a woman whose life was a constant negotiation with the limitations of her class and gender. As the daughter of Thomas Marten, a mole catcher, Maria occupied a precarious social position, respected for the utility of her father's trade but fundamentally excluded from the aspirations of the landed gentry. Contemporary accounts, particularly those of journalist James Curtis, describe her as possessing a handsome face and a fine form, but more importantly, an intellect that far exceeded her strength. Maria's history was marked by a series of relationships that had already labelled her a fallen woman in the eyes of the parish. She had mothered children by 2 different men before her fatal encounter with William Corder. Her first child, fathered by William's own brother, Thomas Corder, had died in infancy. Her second child, Thomas Henry, was the result of an affair with a gentleman named Peter Matthews, who, while providing a regular allowance for the child's upkeep, offered no hope of matrimonial security. These past entanglements were not merely personal failures in the eyes of Victorian society. They were legal liabilities, as Corder would later use the threat of prosecution for having, as they called it, bastard children to manipulate Maria into her final, fatal rendezvous. William Corder, born around 1803, was the son of a relatively prosperous tenant farmer, yet his character early on diverged from the expectations of his class. Known as Foxy during his school years due to a perpetually sly and calculating demeanor, Corder established a pattern of deception that escalated from petty theft to significant fraud. He was known for having stolen his father's pigs and sold them for personal gain, and on another occasion, he sent a forged check for £93 sterling or $127.30 in US dollar. The death of his father and 3 brothers within an 18-month period left William as the sole manager of the 300-acre farm, a responsibility for which he was temperamentally ill-suited. His association with the criminal element of Suffolk, including a notorious individual named Samuel Beauty Smith, suggested a man who felt more at home in the shadows of the illicit than in the respectable light of the agrarian gentry. Smith's reported prophecy that Corder would be hung some of these days underscores a contemporary perception of Corder as a man hurtling toward a violent reckoning. The relationship between Maria and William deepened in 1826, eventually resulting in Maria becoming pregnant for the 3rd time. This child, born in 1827, died within a month of its birth. While Corder and Maria claimed to have buried the infant in Sudbury, it was later suspected that the child had been disposed of in a field, a secret that gave Corder significant leverage over Maria while simultaneously fueling her desperation for the legitimacy of marriage. In the summer of 1827, Corder devised a plan that appeared to be a solution to their mutual predicament. He claimed that the local constable had a warrant for Maria's arrest due to her illegitimate children. He proposed that they elope to Ipswich to be married by license, thereby securing her social standing and placing her beyond the reach of the law. On May 18, 1827, Corder arrived at the Marten cottage and instructed Maria to dress in male attire, presumably to avoid detection by his own family or the authorities, and to meet him at the Red Barn, where she would change into her bridal garments. When Maria Marten stepped out of her father's cottage that May evening, she vanished from the physical world, but she remained a haunting presence in the correspondence of William Corder. For nearly a year, Corder maintained a sophisticated facade of a happy marriage, consistently reassuring the Marten family of Maria's health and well-being. He delivered verbal messages he claimed were from Maria, and when her lack of writing caused alarm, he fabricated excuses that highlighted his manipulative creativity. The psychological toll of this deception on the Marten family was profound. Corder claimed at various times that Maria was suffering from a lame hand that prevented her from holding a pen, or that she was living with his relatives on the Isle of Wight. To his own mother, he claimed Maria was well and that they would return to Polstead once the family's hostility toward the union had cooled down. These letters, often bearing London postmarks while claiming to be from the coast, served as a fragile bridge between the reality of the murder and the fantasy of the elopement. In late September 1827, Corder ostensibly left Polstead for his health, relocating to London where he embarked on a bold attempt to reinvent himself. His method of finding a new partner was as unconventional as it was public. He placed a matrimonial advertisement in the Morning Herald and the Sunday Times. Under the pseudonym A.Z., Corder presented himself as a private gentleman of independent means, seeking a female of respectability. The response to this advertisement was overwhelming, with over 100 women replying to the plea of the social, tender, and sympathizing companion. Among these respondents was Mary Moore, whom Corder married in November 1827. Together, they established a boarding school for young ladies at Everley Grove House in Brentford. This interlude of respectability, where Corder played the role of a successful schoolmaster and husband, stands in chilling contrast to the decomposing remains of his former lover lying beneath the barn floor in Suffolk. The discovery of the crime is often attributed to the supernatural, a narrative element that turned a sordid murder into a Gothic legend. And Marten, Maria's stepmother, began to experience a series of distressing dreams as the anniversary of Maria's departure approached. On 3 consecutive nights, she claimed to have dreamed that Maria had been murdered and buried beneath the floor of the Red Barn. The debate over the authenticity of these dreams remains a focal point of the mystery. While some contemporary observers viewed them as divine intervention, modern historians suggest they were more likely the result of subconscious processing or a strategic legal maneuver. And Marten may have observed Corder's suspicious movements near the barn, such as carrying a pickaxe or hoarding the key, and translated these observations into the socially acceptable form of a prophetic dream to compel her husband, Thomas, into action. Thomas Marten, initially skeptical of his wife's superstition, was eventually worn down by her persistence and resolved to investigate the barn on April 19, 1828. The scene at the Red Barn that April morning was one of grim revelation. Thomas Marten, utilizing his mole spud, a tool designed for seeking life beneath the earth, instead found death. Upon probing the floor of the grain storage bin, he discovered a shallow grave containing a human skeleton wrapped in a sack. The identification of the remains, despite nearly a year of decomposition, was made possible through a combination of dental records and personal effects. Maria's sister, Anne, identified the body based on recognizable hair, clothing, and the absence of a specific tooth in the jawbone. Most damningly, a green handkerchief was found tied tightly around the neck of the corpse. This handkerchief was a known possession of William Corder, which he had been seen wearing and had reportedly gifted to Maria on the day they left. The physical evidence suggested a violent end, but the precise mechanism of death was obscured by the passage of time and the crude methods of the initial exhumation. The news of the discovery triggered an immediate manhunt. James Lee, a diligent officer from London's Lambeth Street Police Office, was tasked with locating the fugitive. Lee tracked Corder to the boarding school in Brentford, where the suspect was found in a state of domestic normalcy, having breakfast with his wife. When Lee announced his purpose, Corder's initial reaction was a blanket denial of ever knowing a woman by the name of Maria Marten. However, the search of Everley Grove House revealed the physical remnants of Corder's past life. Lee discovered a pair of pocket pistols, a powder flask, and a French passport, the latter suggesting that Corder's independent London life was perhaps a prelude to a more permanent escape. Corder was arrested and transported back to Suffolk, a journey that saw him transformed from a respectable schoolmaster into the most reviled man in England.
Before we continue, please don't forget to follow and share. And also, don't forget to check out my other podcast, Conversations with Impact. And thank you all for listening. Now, let's get back to this episode.
The trial of William Corder, which began on August 7, 1828, at the Shire Hall in Bury St Edmunds, was a spectacle of unprecedented scale. The fervour surrounding the case was so intense that the judge and court officials had to physically force their way through the massive crowds gathered at the doors. Chief Baron William Alexander, presiding over the case, lamented the pervasive media hype which he felt threatened the prisoner's right to a fair trial, yet even the legal establishment could not stem the tide of public fascination. The prosecution's strategy was one of redundancy, designed to prevent any possibility of a mistrial due to the ambiguity of the forensic evidence. Corder was indicted on 10 separate counts, each theorizing a different method of murder: shooting, stabbing, strangulation, and combinations thereof. The evidence presented was overwhelming. The testimony of Maria's young brother George regarding the pickaxe, the discovery of the green handkerchief, and the inconsistent lies Corder had told the Marten family over the preceding year. Faced with the grim reality of the evidence, Corder entered a plea of not guilty and offered a defense that combined admission of presence with a denial of malice. He claimed that he and Maria had argued in the barn after she discovered his lack of progress with the marriage license. Corder alleged that as he walked away from her in frustration, he heard a pistol shot and returned to find Maria dead by her own hand, having utilized one of his pistols to end her life. This suicide defense was viewed as ludicrous by the prosecution and the jury alike. The variety of wounds on the body, suggesting multiple methods of attack, and the logistical difficulty of a woman shooting herself and then burying her own body in a sack made Corder's narrative impossible to sustain. The jury required only 35 minutes to reach a verdict of guilty, and Baron Alexander sentenced Corder to be hanged and afterwards dissected, a standard but brutal punishment for the crime of murder. In the 3 days between his sentencing and execution, Corder underwent a period of intense spiritual and psychological turmoil. Under the entreaties of his wife, the prison chaplain, and the governor of the prison, John Orridge, Corder finally confessed to the killing. However, his confession remained a masterclass in mitigation. He claimed he had shot Maria by accident during a scuffle and that he had only buried the body out of fear. He explicitly denied the more gruesome charges of stabbing, despite the physical evidence suggesting otherwise. "I fired. She fell. She died instantly. I have been guilty of great idleness, and at times led a dissolute life, but I hope through the mercy of God to be forgiven." William Corder's written confession. The execution of William Corder on August 11, 1828, was a seminal moment in the history of public punishment in Britain. An estimated 10,000 to 20,000 people converged on Bury St Edmunds, creating a festive yet macabre atmosphere. Corder, reportedly so weak he had to be supported by his jailers, was hanged shortly before noon. The sheer volume of the crowd necessitated the construction of special gallows that protruded from the side of the jail, allowing the maximum number of spectators to witness the monster's end. Following the hanging, the body was cut down and taken to the Shire Hall, where the true anatomical spectacle began. In a practice designed to reinforce the terror of the law, the abdomen was slit open to expose the internal musculature, and the public was allowed to file past the remains. Over 5,000 people queued to catch a glimpse of the dissected killer, a visceral display of justice that satisfied the public's thirst for retribution and scientific curiosity. The day after the execution, Corder's body became the subject of experiments that pushed the boundaries of contemporary medical understanding. A group of physicians and students from Cambridge University reportedly brought a galvanic battery to the dissection. By applying electrical currents to the freshly dead tissue, they were able to demonstrate the contraction of muscles, causing the limbs of the murderer to twitch and move as if possessed by a residual life force. This experiment, while medically grounded in the era's fascination with electricity, also served to elevate Corder's death into the realm of the Gothic. It was a literal manifestation of the Frankenstein anxieties of the time, the idea that science could manipulate the dead for the purposes of both education and spectacle. The dissection further revealed that the cause of death was likely pressure on the spinal cord, as Corder's chest was seen to rise and fall for several minutes after the drop. Because the reassembly of the skeleton was required for further study, the brain could not be examined in detail. Instead, the surgeons focused on a phrenological examination of the skull, a discipline that sought to correlate cranial shape with moral character. The findings, later memorialized in a bust made by Childs of Bungaree, were unsurprisingly consistent with the contemporary view of Corder's depravity. The most enduringly disturbing aspect of the Red Barn murder is the fate of William Corder's physical remains beyond the dissection table. His skin was tanned by surgeon George Creed and used to bind a copy of James Curtis's account of the murder and trial. This book, which remains on display at Moyses Hall Museum, serves as a literal embodiment of the crime, a text about a killer, encased in the killer himself. In 2025, the discovery of a second book at the museum, also bound with Corder's skin, highlighted the extent to which the Victorian medical and legal establishment sought to preserve and commodify the criminal body. The practice of anthropodermic bibliopagy, while rare, was a potent symbol of total judicial control. The state not only took the criminal's life but claimed his physical essence as an artifact of permanent record. Corder's skeleton followed a similar path, being exhibited at the West Suffolk Hospital and the Hunterian Museum for over 170 years before finally being cremated in 2004. The Red Barn murder birthed a secondary industry of relics and souvenirs that catered to a public eager to own a piece of horror. The Red Barn itself was systematically dismantled by souvenir hunters, who stripped the boards to a height of several feet to take home as mementos. Even Maria's grave suffered. The original headstone was chipped away bit by visitors until it entirely disappeared, leaving the site marked only by a wooden plaque nailed to a nearby shed. Staffordshire pottery manufacturers capitalized on the craze by producing models of the Red Barn and Maria Marten's cottage, which were sold in thousands of homes across Britain. These objects, intended for display on Victorian mantels, transformed a site of murder into a decorative novelty. Broadside publishers, most notably James Catnach of London, sold over 1 million copies of confessional ballads supposedly written by Corder, further blurring the line between the reality of the crime and the commercialized fiction of the street. The transformation of the Red Barn murder into a folk legend was completed through the medium of performance. Melodramas based on the case were staple entertainment for decades, often simplifying the complex social realities of Polstead into a binary struggle between a wicked squire and an innocent maiden. These plays introduced elements that would become iconic: the gypsy lover, the poisoned child, and the central role of the supernatural dream. In 1935, the story was adapted into a major motion picture, Murder in the Red Barn, starring Todd Slaughter. Slaughter's portrayal of Corder as a cackling, theatrical villain solidified the public's image of the killer for the 20th century, emphasizing the bride of death motif and the atmospheric horror of the Suffolk countryside. While the film deviated significantly from the historical records, its success demonstrated the enduring power of the Red Barn narrative as a quintessential English mystery. The persistence of the Polstead mystery in the Red Barn murder remains a cornerstone of British criminal history, because it occupies a unique space where the visceral reality of a violent act meets the boundless creativity of the human imagination. This case emerged just as mass media was beginning to thrive and satisfy society's growing desire for sensational stories, at a time when the medical community held both authority and intimidation over the public. In conclusion, this story of Maria Marten is more than a tale of a fallen woman and her deceitful lover. It is a narrative of social vulnerability and the terrifying efficiency with which a person can be erased from existence, only to be resurrected as a ghost, a ballad, and a museum artifact. As long as the skin-bound books of William Corder exist and the legend of Anne Martin's dreams is retold, the Red Barn will continue to stand in the collective consciousness as a testament to the enduring mystery of human depravity and the eternal echo of a cry for justice on Barnfield Hill.
Thank you, listeners, for listening. I would love to hear any feedback or comments, or what you would like to hear about next. Stay tuned for more. And please don't forget to follow and share and heart me. Until next time, my good friends.